The basement was silent except for the steady drip of water somewhere in the darkness. Detective Maria Santos had seen enough crime scenes to fill 3 lifetimes, but this one made her stomach turn. Not because of what she found, but because of what she didn't find. No fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses, no pattern that made sense. Just another body, another family destroyed, another case that would join the stack of files marked unsolved. What she didn't know was that she was staring at the work of a killer whose name would never make headlines. A predator so methodical, so invisible, that even seasoned FBI profilers would struggle to comprehend his methods. While the world obsesses over Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer, monsters like this one slip through the cracks of history, leaving behind trails of devastation that most people will never hear about. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on America's forgotten killers. The ones who murdered dozens, maybe hundreds, while the media chased more sensational stories. The ones who perfected their craft in the shadows, who turned killing into an art form so precise it defied every rule law enforcement thought they knew. These aren't your typical true crime cases. These are the nightmares that kept FBI agents awake, the puzzles that shattered careers, the monsters that proved evil doesn't always wear a famous face. Before we dive into these cases, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. And make sure to hit that subscribe button because what you're about to hear will change how you think about serial killers forever. The truth is, America has produced over 3,000 documented serial killers since 1900. 3,000. That means for every household name you recognize, there are dozens more whose stories have been buried beneath decades of silence, bureaucratic failures, and societal indifference. Tonight, you'll meet killers who were more organized than Bundy, more brutal than Dahmer, and more elusive than the Zodiac. You'll discover why their names never became legend, and more importantly, why that might be the most terrifying part of all. What makes a serial killer famous? Is it the body count, the method, the victims, or is it something darker, something that reveals more about us than we'd like to admit? The cases we're about to explore will force you to confront an uncomfortable reality. That evil doesn't always announce itself with theatrical flair or media-friendly sound bites. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it wears scrubs and saves lives by day. Sometimes it plans for years, decades even, leaving behind kill kits buried across multiple states like some twisted treasure map of death. The first name on our list operated for over a decade without anyone connecting his crimes. He was a nurse, trusted, respected, someone patients felt safe with, someone families thanked for his care. But every few weeks, when that familiar feeling crept into his chest, when the world felt too normal and his hands too clean, he would visit the piano bars of Manhattan. He called himself a wolf among sheep, but even that doesn't capture the calculated cruelty of what he became known as. The Last Call Killer. Richard Westall. Rogers Jr. looked like someone's uncle. Soft-spoken, polite, the kind of man who held doors and remembered birthdays. At Mount Sinai Medical Center, he was Employee of the Month material. Patients loved him. Colleagues respected him. No one suspected that behind those gentle eyes lived something that shouldn't exist in a human being. Between 1991 and 1993, when New York City was drowning in violence and the AIDS epidemic was claiming thousands, Rogers stalked the gay bars of Manhattan with the patience of a spider. His method was terrifyingly simple. He would wait until last call, that moment when bartenders announce the final round and desperate souls scramble for connection. That's when he struck. Not with violence, not with force, but with kindness. A smile, a conversation, maybe a drink. His victims trusted him because he seemed safe, normal, human. Thomas Mulcahy was 28 when Rogers convinced him to leave Townhouse Bar on East 58th Street. Anthony Marrero was 30 when he met Rogers at The Works, a piano bar in the East Village. Both men thought they were going home with someone who cared about them. Instead, they became pieces in a puzzle so horrific that when police found the first remains, they couldn't believe one person had done it. Rogers didn't just kill his victims, he dissected them. With the precision of someone who understood human anatomy, who knew exactly where to cut, how to separate, what parts would be hardest to identify. He packaged their remains in garbage bags and scattered them along highways in 3 different states: Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York. Each drop-off was calculated, each location chosen to maximize the chance that evidence would be contaminated or lost. He turned murder into a science and disposal into an art form. What made Rogers even more terrifying was his restraint. 4 confirmed victims over 3 years. Not a frenzied killing spree, but a methodical campaign. He could have killed more, much more. But he understood something that most serial killers don't. That patience is power. That spacing out murders makes patterns harder to detect. That being selective makes you invisible. While other killers were getting caught because of their compulsions, Rogers was perfecting his craft. The investigation that eventually caught him reveals everything wrong with how we handle cases involving marginalized victims. These weren't random homeless men or runaways. These were professionals, students, men with families who loved them. But because they were gay, because they died during an epidemic that many saw as divine punishment, because they were found in pieces rather than whole, their cases didn't get the resources they deserved. Detectives were overwhelmed, forensics were limited, and the media treated each discovery like a brief curiosity rather than evidence of a predator stalking the city. Rogers understood this. He knew that society's prejudices would work in his favor. He knew that investigations into gay men's deaths would be half-hearted. He knew that families would have to fight just to get basic information about their loved ones' cases. He weaponized bigotry, turned societal indifference into his shield, and it worked for years. When they finally caught him in 2001, it wasn't because of brilliant detective work or advanced forensics. It was because a fingerprint from 1993 finally got processed through a database that didn't exist when the crimes were committed. Rogers had been living a normal life for 8 years, working, paying taxes, probably helping patients at the hospital. The monster and the man coexisted so seamlessly that even after his arrest, colleagues couldn't believe it. During interrogation, Rogers revealed something that chills law enforcement to this day. He wasn't driven by voices or visions or childhood trauma. He killed because he enjoyed it, because it felt good, because he could. When asked about his victims, he spoke about them like specimens, noting their reactions, their pleas, their final moments with the detached curiosity of a scientist. He had turned human suffering into entertainment, death into a hobby, and he had been very, very good at it. The case files suggest Rogers may have killed far more than the 4 confirmed victims. Similar murders in other cities, other states, other time periods. Bodies found dismembered along highways, victims who disappeared from bars, cases that went cold because no one connected them. But Rogers isn't talking. Even facing life in prison, even with nothing left to lose, he keeps his secrets. Because for killers like Rogers, the murders aren't just about death. They're about power. And the ultimate power is knowing something the rest of the world will never understand. What Rogers represents is perhaps the most terrifying type of serial killer. Not the disorganized psychotic who leaves evidence everywhere. Not the attention-seeking narcissist who wants fame, but the methodical predator who kills for pleasure and has the intelligence to never get caught. Rogers only got caught because technology advanced beyond what he could have predicted. Without that fingerprint database, he might still be out there, still working at hospitals, still trusted by patients, still hunting. The most disturbing part about Rogers wasn't what he did to his victims. It was what he did to himself afterward. Colleagues remember him coming to work the morning after murders, cheerful and refreshed. He would hum while preparing medications, chat warmly with patients, even volunteer for extra shifts. The killing didn't drain him. It recharged him, like some twisted battery that needed human suffering to function properly. This pattern of normalcy between kills reveals something law enforcement struggles to accept: that monsters don't always look monstrous. They don't pace hospital corridors muttering to themselves or leave cryptic messages for police. Sometimes they're the person you trust with your life. Sometimes they save you on Tuesday and hunt someone else on Friday. Rogers perfected the art of compartmentalization, keeping his two selves so separate that neither contaminated the other. But Rogers was just the beginning. Our next case takes us from the calculated precision of a medical professional to something far more chaotic. Something that defied every rule the FBI thought they knew about serial killers. If Rogers was a surgeon with his victims, our next killer was an architect of terror who spent years building the perfect murder machine. Alaska, 2012. A coffee shop called Common Grounds in Anchorage. 18-year-old Samantha Koenig was working alone when a man in a ski mask walked through the door. Security cameras captured what happened next, but what they couldn't capture was that this wasn't random. This wasn't opportunity. This was the final act of a plan that had been in motion for over a decade. The man behind the mask was Israel Keyes, and when FBI agents finally pieced together his story, they realized they weren't dealing with a serial killer. They were dealing with something unprecedented, something that made every other case look like amateur hour. Keyes didn't fit any profile. He had no type of victim, no geographic pattern, no consistent method. He killed men, women, children, families. He operated in Alaska, Vermont, Washington, Texas, New York. Sometimes he used guns, sometimes knives, sometimes his bare hands. To traditional profiling, he was impossible. To the FBI's behavioral analysis unit, he was their worst nightmare made real. What made Keyes different was time. Not the time between kills, but the time he spent preparing. While other serial killers operated on impulse or opportunity, Keyes planned for years. Literally years. He would drive thousands of miles to bury what he called murder kits in remote locations across the United States. Buckets filled with weapons, cash, tools for restraining victims, chemicals for dissolving bodies. He created a network of death scattered across the country, each cache positioned and waiting for the day he might need it. The methodology was brilliant and terrifying. Keyes would purchase a one-way plane ticket to a major city, always paying cash. He would rent a car under a false identity, then drive for days, sometimes weeks, following routes he had memorized years earlier. Along the way, he would stop at burial sites only he knew about, retrieving the tools he needed for whatever he had planned. No paper trail, no digital footprint, no way for law enforcement to track him. But the kill kits were just infrastructure. The real genius was in his victim selection. Keyes had no type because having a type gets you caught. Instead, he developed what he called opportunity hunting. He would arrive in a new city with no target in mind, no plan beyond the general urge to kill. Then he would drive around, sometimes for days, looking for the perfect situation. Isolated houses, vulnerable individuals, circumstances where disappearances might go unnoticed for crucial hours or days. The Currier family in Vermont learned this the hard way. Bill and Lorraine Currier were chosen completely at random. Keyes had flown to Chicago, driven over 1,000 miles north, spent days scouting neighborhoods until he found their house. What made them targets wasn't who they were or what they looked like. It was that their home was positioned perfectly for what he had in mind. Remote enough for privacy, accessible enough for a quick escape, positioned so that screams wouldn't carry to neighbors. Keyes broke in during the early morning hours, bound both victims, and forced them into his rental car. What happened next remains largely unknown because their bodies were never found. Keyes took them somewhere else, somewhere he had prepared in advance, and by the time anyone realized they were missing, he was already back in Alaska, living his normal life as a construction worker and father. This wasn't passion or psychosis. This was industrial murder. Keyes had turned killing into a business, complete with supply chains, logistics planning, and quality control. He studied his own methods, refined his techniques, learned from near misses and close calls. Each murder made him better at the next one. Each successful disposal taught him new ways to hide evidence. He was evolving, becoming more efficient, more invisible, more deadly. The FBI estimates Keyes killed at least 11 people, but that number is based on drawings he made in his jail cell. 11 skulls, drawn in his own blood, each one potentially representing a life he had taken. But even Keyes admitted the real number was higher, much higher. When agents pressed him for details, he would smile and say they would never know the full extent of his work. Never understand how many people had vanished into his network of buried kits and forgotten graves. What terrified investigators most was his timeline. Keyes had been active for over 14 years, possibly longer. 14 years of flying to random cities, driving thousands of miles, hunting victims across multiple states. 14 years of perfect murders, bodies that were never found, families that never got answers. If Samantha Koenig hadn't been captured on security camera, if Keyes hadn't made one crucial mistake with her debit card, he might still be out there. The mistake that brought him down reveals everything about his mindset. After killing Samantha Koenig, Keyes kept her debit card. Not for the money, but as a trophy. He used it in multiple states, knowing that each transaction created a digital trail. When FBI agents asked him why he took such a stupid risk, Keyes laughed. He said he was bored. That after years of perfect murders, he wanted to see if he could still get away with being careless. This wasn't the behavior of someone losing control. This was the behavior of someone who'd become so good at killing that murder itself was no longer challenging. Keyes had solved the serial killer problem. He had figured out how to kill without getting caught, how to make people disappear without leaving traces, how to satisfy his urges without consequences. The only thing left was to see if he could beat the system while actively helping law enforcement build a case against him. During his interrogation, Keyes revealed details that kept FBI agents awake at night. He spoke about murders like art projects, describing the satisfaction of planning, the rush of execution, the peace that came from knowing his victims would never be found. He talked about families he had destroyed, communities he had terrorized, lives he had erased as if discussing the weather. There was no remorse, no guilt, no recognition that his victims had been human beings with hopes and dreams and people who loved them. The geographical scope of his crimes defied comprehension. Kill kits buried in Washington, New York, Vermont, Texas, probably dozens of other states. Murders committed across time zones, across seasons, across years. Victims chosen from different demographics, different social classes, different circumstances. If law enforcement struggled to connect crimes committed by killers who operated in single cities, how could they possibly track someone who treated the entire United States as his hunting ground? Keyes understood this. He knew that jurisdictional boundaries would work in his favor, that evidence from a murder in Vermont wouldn't be compared to evidence from a disappearance in Texas, that patterns spanning multiple states would be nearly impossible to detect. He weaponized the very structure of American law enforcement, turning our divided system into his greatest asset. When Keyes committed suicide in his jail cell in December 2012, he took his secrets with him. The locations of his kill kits, the identities of his victims, the methods he used to dispose of bodies. All of it died with him, leaving families without closure and law enforcement without answers. But he left behind something else. A new understanding of what serial killers could become when they applied intelligence, patience, and resources to the art of murder. The investigation files remain open to this day, not because authorities believe they can solve them, but because they know they've only scratched the surface. Somewhere in America, buried in forests and fields and forgotten corners of wilderness, are buckets filled with evidence of crimes that will never see courtrooms. And somewhere in those same files are missing person reports that will never be connected to the man who made them disappear. But Keyes represented evolution, the next level of predatory intelligence. Our third case takes us in the opposite direction entirely, to a killer so chaotic, so unpredictable, that his own confessions couldn't be trusted. A man who turned the American South into his personal hunting ground and earned a nickname that still makes veteran detectives uncomfortable. They called him the meanest man in America, and even that doesn't capture the depths of what Donald Henry Gaskins became. South Carolina, 1969. The coastal highways stretched like arteries through swampland and pine forests, carrying travelers between cities that seemed worlds apart. It was perfect hunting territory for someone who understood that people disappeared on those roads all the time. Breakdowns, wrong turns, hitchhikers who climbed into the wrong car. The kind of disappearances that got filed under missing persons and forgotten when no leads materialized. Gaskins called them his coastal kills. Not because they happened near the ocean, but because he hunted the coastal roads like a shark, following blood trails through dark water. Every 6 weeks, when the feeling became too strong to ignore, when what he described as his bothersomeness demanded satisfaction, he would climb into his car and go looking for relief. What he found were people whose only mistake was being in the wrong place when a monster went hunting. The first was a blonde hitchhiker in September of that year. Gaskins picked her up somewhere between Charleston and Myrtle Beach, drove her to a location he had prepared in advance, and spent hours discovering what human beings would endure before they stopped being human. When he was finished, he weighted her body and dropped it into swampland that had been swallowing secrets for centuries. She was never found, never identified, never missed by anyone who knew where to look. That should have been the end of it. One moment of violence, one body feeding the gators, one family somewhere wondering why their daughter never came home. But for Gaskins, it was just the beginning. Because what he discovered that night was that killing felt better than anything he had ever experienced. Better than drugs, better than sex, better than any high the world could offer. He had found his calling, and he was very, very good at it. What separated Gaskins from other serial killers wasn't his methods or his body count. It was his complete lack of boundaries. Most killers develop patterns, preferences, limits that define their hunting behavior. Gaskins had none. Men, women, children, elderly victims, strangers, acquaintances, people he had known for years. If someone crossed his path when the bothersomeness was strong, they became potential prey. Age, gender, relationship, none of it mattered when the hunger took hold. His approach to murder was equally chaotic. Sometimes he used guns, sometimes knives, sometimes his bare hands. He poisoned victims, drowned them, burned them alive, tortured them for days before ending their suffering. Each killing was an experiment, a chance to explore new methods, new levels of cruelty. He kept detailed mental notes about what worked, what didn't, what produced the most satisfying results. The geographical scope of his hunting ground covered multiple states. Gaskins would drive for hundreds of miles when the mood struck, crossing into North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, anywhere the roads took him and opportunity presented itself. He understood that spreading murders across jurisdictions would make patterns harder to detect, but that wasn't strategy. That was just how his compulsions worked. The bothersomeness didn't recognize state lines or police boundaries. What made Gaskins particularly dangerous was his ability to blend into normal society between kills. He worked construction jobs, maintained relationships, even had a family. To his neighbors, he was just another working man trying to get by in the rural South. Rough around the edges maybe, but harmless. They had no idea that every few weeks their friendly neighbor became something that shouldn't exist in the same reality as their children and Sunday dinners. The timeline of his crimes reveals the methodical nature hidden beneath the chaos. From 1969 to 1982, Gaskins claimed to have committed what he called coastal kills on a regular schedule. Sometimes monthly, sometimes every 6 weeks. Always when the internal pressure became unbearable. He described it like a biological function, something his body needed to maintain equilibrium. But Gaskins wasn't just a serial killer. He was also a businessman who understood that death could be profitable. While he killed strangers for personal satisfaction, he also accepted contracts from people who wanted problems eliminated permanently. These weren't coastal kills driven by internal compulsion. These were what he called serious murders, professional hits carried out for money and favors. The distinction reveals something crucial about Gaskins' psychology. He could separate his personal killing from his professional killing, maintaining different standards and methods for each. The coastal kills were chaotic, experimental, driven by psychological need. The serious murders were clean, efficient, business transactions that left no loose ends or unnecessary suffering. He was essentially two different killers operating in the same body. Law enforcement struggled to understand this duality. Traditional profiling suggested that serial killers operated from consistent psychological drives and patterns. Gaskins shattered those assumptions by demonstrating that a single individual could compartmentalize multiple killing personalities, each with its own rules and motivations. He was organized when money was involved, disorganized when satisfying personal urges. The number of victims remains disputed because Gaskins himself couldn't provide accurate counts. During various confessions and interviews, he claimed anywhere from 15 to over 90 murders. The wide range wasn't because he was lying, but because he genuinely couldn't remember them all. Some kills blended together in his memory. Others were so routine, they barely registered as significant events. He had turned murder into such a regular part of his life that individual victims lost their distinctiveness. What investigators found most disturbing was Gaskins' complete lack of empathy or recognition of his victims' humanity. When pressed for details about specific murders, he would describe them in clinical terms, noting technical aspects like disposal methods or the effectiveness of different weapons. He showed more emotion discussing car repairs than he did recounting how he tortured families to death. This emotional disconnection extended to his own family and friends. People who knew Gaskins described him as charming when he wanted to be, capable of genuine affection and loyalty. But those same people also noted that something was missing behind his eyes, something fundamental that connected most humans to their conscience and moral reasoning. He could mimic normal emotional responses, but couldn't actually experience them. The investigation that eventually brought him down revealed the scope of his activities and the inadequacy of law enforcement responses during his active years. Bodies were found sporadically across multiple states, often so decomposed that identification was impossible. Missing person reports piled up in different jurisdictions, but no one was connecting disappearances across state lines or looking for patterns in highway murders. Gaskins understood this systemic weakness and exploited it ruthlessly. He knew that rural police departments didn't have the resources or communication systems to track killers who operated across wide geographical areas. He knew that transient victims wouldn't generate the same investigative pressure as missing locals. He weaponized the isolation and independence of small-town law enforcement, turning their limitations into his advantages. When authorities finally arrested him in 1975, it wasn't for serial murder. It was for the kidnapping and assault of 2 teenagers who managed to escape and identify him. The coastal kills and serious murders only came to light during subsequent investigations, when Gaskins decided that confessing to multiple murders might help his legal situation. It didn't, but it did reveal the true scope of what had been happening on those lonely coastal roads. Even after his arrest, Gaskins continued killing. In 1982, while on death row, he murdered another inmate using a bomb smuggled into the prison. The victim was Rudolph Tyner, convicted of killing an elderly couple, and Gaskins had been hired for the hit by the victim's son. Even behind bars, even facing execution, he couldn't stop himself from finding new ways to end human life. The prison murder earned him the title that followed him to his execution: the meanest man in America. But that nickname only captured part of his nature. Gaskins wasn't just mean, he was empty. A void in human form that consumed life and gave nothing back. He had turned killing into both compulsion and profession, personal satisfaction and business opportunity. His execution in 1991 should have ended the story, but Gaskins left behind something that continues to haunt investigators. Somewhere in the swamps and forests of the American South are graves that will never be found. Bodies of victims whose names were never learned, whose disappearances were never connected to the man who killed them. Families who spent decades wondering what happened to their loved ones, never knowing they had encountered something that existed beyond the boundaries of human understanding. The Gaskins case represents everything wrong with how America handles serial murder. Jurisdictional boundaries that prevent information sharing, resource limitations that leave cases unsolved, societal prejudices that determine which victims receive attention. While law enforcement chased headlines and media-friendly cases, monsters like Gaskins operated in the shadows, turning America's highways into hunting grounds and its rural communities into graveyards. But even Gaskins, with all his chaos and cruelty, operated within certain geographical and temporal boundaries. Our next case breaks those rules entirely, takes us into territory where traditional law enforcement not only failed, but created the conditions that allowed systematic murder to flourish unchecked. Washington, D.C., 1971. The nation's capital was supposed to represent American ideals of justice and equality, but for families in the southeast neighborhoods, it had become something else entirely. A place where children disappeared, and authorities seemed more interested in maintaining political appearances than finding killers. Where systemic racism and institutional neglect created perfect hunting conditions for a predator who understood that some victims mattered less than others. The freeway phantom didn't just kill children. He made them complicit in their own destruction, forcing them to participate in rituals of humiliation before ending their lives. He turned murder into psychological torture that extended far beyond physical death, creating trauma that rippled through families and communities for generations. And he did it all while law enforcement looked the other way, more concerned with protecting the capital's reputation than protecting its most vulnerable residents. The first victim was Carol Denise Spinks, just 10 years old, walking home from a 7-Eleven on Benning Road. It was April 25th, 1971, and Carol had done what thousands of children do every day. She bought candy and started the short walk back to her apartment. She never made it. Her body was found 6 days later on Interstate 295, the Anacostia Freeway. She had been sexually assaulted, strangled, and left beside the road like discarded trash. What made Carol's murder different wasn't the brutality. In a city drowning in violence, one more dead child should have been tragic but unremarkable. What made it different was the note. Tucked into her clothing was a piece of paper with handwriting that would haunt investigators for decades. The killer had written a message, taunting police, promising more victims, demonstrating a level of psychological sophistication that went far beyond simple murder. But the note wasn't just communication. It was a declaration of war against a system the killer knew wouldn't fight back. Because Carol Spinks was black, because she lived in Southeast DC, because her family didn't have political connections or media influence. Her death generated minimal investigation and even less public outrage. The freeway phantom understood this reality and weaponized it, turning societal indifference into operational security. 5 months later, 16-year-old Darlenia Denise Johnson disappeared while walking to her job at a neighborhood store. Her body was found on the same stretch of freeway, bearing the same evidence of sexual assault and strangulation. But this time, the killer had escalated. Johnson had been held for days before her murder, tortured psychologically as well as physically. The autopsy revealed that she had been fed during captivity, kept alive deliberately to extend her suffering. These forgotten monsters remind us that evil doesn't always announce itself with headlines or documentaries. Sometimes it whispers from hospital corridors, hides behind friendly faces, operates in shadows where society refuses to look. The names Rogers, Keyes, Gaskins, and the Phantom may never become household words, but their victims deserved better than obscurity. They deserved justice, remembrance, and the uncomfortable truth that monsters walk among us wearing masks of normalcy. If this opened your eyes to the killer's history, forgot, subscribe, and share their stories, because forgetting them means forgetting the people they destroyed.